Have you ever just looked at a map of the world and wondered why? Why do some nations have these massive pools of incredible wealth, gleaming infrastructure, and just towering skylines, while others, sometimes literally right next door, are trapped in these endless cycles of crippling poverty and instability? It's honestly the ultimate high-stakes puzzle of our time, right? The difference between long-term national stability and total economic collapse. Well, welcome to this explainer on the mechanics of national success. Today, we're going to deconstruct the actual, proven blueprint of how countries build lasting wealth. It's a fascinating journey, so let's dive right in.
So this is the central mystery of development economics. Why do some countries consistently grow while others just stagnate? And I really want you to notice the emphasis on the word achieve here. Because national wealth, it is not a geographical accident. It's not just about who randomly has the most oil or, the best natural ports. It's actually the direct result of very deliberate structural choices. And to really understand those choices, we need to look under the hood at the underlying machinery of an economy.
Here's a quick roadmap for our investigation today. We're going to start with the great global mystery of wealth disparity, uncover the actual engine of prosperity, look at some historical winners, examine the main culprits behind national failure, and then wrap up with a modern blueprint for the 21st century. All right, Section 1, the great global mystery. And rolling right into Section 2, the engine of prosperity. When you look at the global landscape, the stark contrasts between thriving nations and stagnant ones can honestly be jarring. We're talking about the difference between generations enjoying rising living standards versus generations dealing with rising inequality, unemployment, and just deep political frustration. But if you strip away all the complex economic jargon, the secret sauce behind national wealth always boils down to one incredibly powerful concept. It's the ultimate driver of human progress: total factor productivity, or TFP. Now, I know, that sounds like a super wonky term, but let's break it down. TFP is simply how efficiently a country combines its people, its money, its technology, and its rules to create value. It's the difference between temporarily growing just by throwing more bodies at a problem versus sustainably growing by actually innovating. So the absolute crucial takeaway here is that rising TFP is what actually pays for higher wages. It pays for better public schools. It pays for stronger healthcare. It is, quite literally, the economic definition of working smarter, not just harder. To consistently raise that productivity, developing nations basically have to walk this very specific structural transformation pathway. It's like a giant ladder. Countries almost always start down in agriculture. From there, they move to industrialization and expand their manufacturing base. That naturally leads to urbanization because, people are moving to the cities for those factory jobs. Then they modernize their services, and finally, they hit the top rung, a high-tech knowledge economy. That right there is the ladder from poverty to prosperity. If you miss a rung, you get trapped. Moving to Section 3, how winning nations succeed. So who actually made it to the top of that ladder? Let's take a look at the winners. The countries that successfully executed this massive, incredibly complex structural transformation. And our first piece of evidence is Japan. After World War II, Japan's economy was in absolute ruins, just devastated. Yet in only a few decades, they pulled off one of the most dramatic economic rebuilds in human history through state-guided industrialization. So how exactly did they pull this off?
Well, they used a highly specific policy mix. Japan was relentlessly focused on adopting foreign technology, vastly expanding education, and building a massive export manufacturing sector. But the real secret weapon here was coordination. Japan's Ministry of International Trade and Industry, famously known as MITI, actively guided and coordinated this whole industrial upgrading process. They essentially proved that strategic state intervention, when paired with a hyper-focus on high-quality manufacturing, can absolutely supercharge productivity.
Okay, let's look at another stunning example: South Korea. Following the Korean War, South Korea was poorer than a lot of developing nations are today. Like back in the 1960s, their GDP per capita was roughly on par with some of the poorest nations in West Africa. It's wild to think about. Yet they managed to rise from the utter devastation of conflict to become a global industrial and innovation powerhouse. And I want you to really notice South Korea's sequence strategy here. They didn't just wake up one day and try to build advanced microchips. They started at the bottom with land reform and basic education. The state directed credit to these large family-owned conglomerates, which you might know as chaebols. And then they very carefully sequenced their industrial upgrading. They started with basic textiles, they took those profits and skills, moved into steel and shipbuilding, then up into electronics, and finally all the way to advanced semiconductors. It was just a masterclass in long-term strategic planning. Our third major case study is China, which underwent a structural transformation so massive it lifted hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. Truly, it's one of the fastest, largest productivity transformations in human history, and it was driven by a very specific blend of gradual reform and state capitalism. See, China's approach heavily rejected what economists call shock therapy, those overnight radical market shifts. They said no to that. Instead, they opted for super gradual reforms. They started in agriculture, then they created these special economic zones to sort of experiment with foreign investment and export manufacturing. And they paired all of this with truly unprecedented investments in physical infrastructure, gradually integrating into the global market while always maintaining strict state coordination. Section 4. Why some nations fail. Because, of course, not every story is a success story, right? We have to pivot now and look at the culprits that hold nations back and trap them in poverty. Look at this real-world contrast. The absolute foundation of failure is weak institutions. Strong institutions give you predictability, they give you protected property rights, and real investor confidence. That is an environment where people actually want to build things and innovate. Weak institutions, on the other hand, they give you cronyism, capital flight, and political instability. Listen, if the rules change every single week, or if a few elites simply capture all the state resources for themselves, meritocracy dies, investors flee, innovation just stops cold. And beyond weak institutions, there are three other major traps, the culprits of stagnation. First up is the resource curse. This happens when a country is so incredibly wealthy in one single natural resource, like oil, for example, that it completely neglects to build a diversified manufacturing base. Second is premature deindustrialization. This is when developing nations lose their manufacturing capacity to cheap imports or automation before they've actually gotten rich, which traps them in low-wage, informal service jobs. And third, frequent policy reversals. I mean, it makes sense, right? You literally cannot build a factory designed to last 10 years if the government's economic policy completely flips every 6 months. So, knowing all this leads us to a highly provocative question. If the blueprint for prosperity is out there, if we can clearly factually see exactly what Japan, South Korea, and China did, why don't all failing countries just copy it? Like, why not just flip the switch and do the exact same thing? Well, because structural reform isn't just an economics equation. It is deeply, deeply political. Every single time you try to reform an economy, you create winners and losers. For sure, the winners are usually the exciting new industries and the skilled labor force. But what about the losers? The losers are very often state-protected monopolies, heavily subsidized legacy industries, and deeply entrenched political elites who currently hold all the cards. And let me tell you, those elites will fiercely resist any reform that threatens their monopolies or their cash flow. This is exactly why technically brilliant economic reforms so often crash and burn politically. All right, bringing us to our final part, Section 5, the 21st Century Blueprint. So, knowing everything we now know, what do we do today? Let's look at some actionable takeaways tailored to the unique, super fast-moving pressures of our modern global economy. For countries that are currently trapped in stagnation, the very first steps are foundational. Before you can even think about building advanced industries, you have to build institutional credibility. You need independent judiciaries. You need ruthless anti-corruption agencies. Next, you have to invest incredibly deeply in human capital. We're talking universal education and targeted technical training. Because without skilled workers, you simply cannot absorb new technology. And finally, governments absolutely need to pursue export-oriented industrial policies. Why? Because competing on a global stage practically forces your domestic companies to step up, improve their quality, and get way more efficient. Now, once those foundations are actually being laid, it's time to modernize the whole system. You've got to upgrade the physical infrastructure, ports, power grids, but also the digital infrastructure, which is crucial nowadays. And here is a huge one. You must formalize the economy. If the majority of your businesses are operating in the shadows just to avoid complex taxes and red tape, they can't get bank loans, they can't scale up. Simplifying regulations brings them into the light. And overarching this entire process is the absolute need for strict macroeconomic discipline. You have to keep inflation low and keep debt sustainable so investors feel completely safe bringing their money to the table. But here is the catch. The ladder to prosperity, it's actively shifting right in front of us. The old, reliable path of using cheap labor for basic manufacturing is actively being threatened by AI and automation. At the exact same time, this massive global shift toward the green energy transition, solar panels, advanced batteries, EVs, is creating entirely new, incredibly high productivity sectors for the countries that move fast enough to grab them. Plus, geopolitical tensions are completely realigning global supply chains as we speak. So, the countries that figure out how to adapt to these three specific modern pressures, they are going to be the next generation's economic winners. To sum up everything we've uncovered from our source material today, it all really comes back to this one powerful, undeniable truth. Nations prosper when they continuously raise productivity through institutional strength, technological capability, and structural transformation. Remember, wealth is not a static endpoint. You don't just arrive there and stop. It is a continuous, ongoing process of adapting your institutions and constantly upskilling your people so you can work smarter. Which leaves us with this final, critical question for you to consider today. Just look around you. How is your own country positioning its human capital and its institutions for the AI and green energy transitions? Are you actively building the foundation for the next century of prosperity? Or are you just resting on the architecture of the past? Think about it. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer.